The second Trump administration was meant to bring about a showdown between the US and China. Tariffs, trade wars, a reorientation of US military priorities. We have heard it all. But so far, the White House has escalated against pretty much everyone but Beijing. So, how tough will Donald Trump be on China? Join me tonight to find out here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. Our main story tonight focuses on what is perhaps the most important bilateral axis in international politics today, the U.S. China relations. The two largest economies and military powers on the planet. Never fully in conflict, but not too friendly either. The history of that relationship is marked by diplomatic caution and mutual respect, but also by distrust and a growing economic rivalry. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, Washington and Beijing have become increasingly interconnected. Today, a total decoupling seems unrealistic due to mutual dependencies in renewable energy technologies, semiconductors, car manufacturing, and many other sectors. But that, of course, hasn't stopped Donald Trump from making threats aimed at China. Before he took office, a hawkish policy towards Xi Jinping was supposed to be the one thing that was easy to predict. But so far, that hasn't materialized. And why is that? We look for answers in our report.
From a formal standpoint, the modern relationship between China and the US is not a particularly old one. Washington officially recognized the People's Republic only in 1979, a few years after Beijing gained a seat in the United Nations. But that recognition came with a certain ambiguity. Parallel to the recognition of the PRC, the US passed the Taiwan Relations Act. It promised to maintain unofficial but steady relations with Taipei, despite it being seen by Chinese communists as a rogue actor. Independent of the political tensions, economic cooperation flourished. Since the paradigm shift of the mid-1980s and gradual policy liberalization, Chinese exports to the US have exploded. Further acceleration came with Beijing joining WTO and continues to this day. A profound conviction that the free market would bring about democratic change led most Western leaders into a trap of heavy dependency. For the fiscal year 2024, the US had a deficit of $360 billion in bilateral trade with China. Beijing also became the second highest foreign owner of America's public debt. Adding to that the almost monopolistic position of China in renewable energy technologies, the view from Washington is pretty grim. Donald Trump promised to change it with the introduction of sweeping tariffs on almost everything, but it isn't certain this tactic will bring any effect.
The tariffs work out.
Last year, the Chinese economy registered an international trade surplus of $1 trillion. That means Beijing has a huge head start in a trade war with any other country. Trump wanted to be tough on Xi Jinping, but the political and economic realities will force him to modify his stance.
How far will Donald Trump go in his crusade against Beijing? Will China retaliate? And who will be hit the hardest? What's next for Taiwan, given the prevailing uncertainty in global politics? These are some of the most important questions in international affairs right now. So we decided to bring in experts who can answer them. And I'm pleased to say, joining me tonight on Wider View are Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, and Professor Kerry Brown from King's College, London. Good evening, both, and welcome to Wider View.
Evening.
Isabel, I want to start with you and ask you to map out where we are right now, because it's been a little over 2 weeks since the inauguration of Donald Trump, and we have heard more or less serious threats against Greenland, Panama, Colombia, Canada, Mexico, a host of international institutions. but nothing particularly hard on Beijing. The only thing that came out just recently is the introduction of the first bunch of tariffs, but in terms of declarations, nothing particularly offensive. Where is this change in attitude coming from compared to the campaign time last year?
It is very curious, isn't it? You would think that Denmark was the United States' worst enemy, to listen to Donald Trump, and certainly during the campaign, he talked a very, very big game on tariffs. For example, he talked about 60% tariffs. Instead, what we have is a relatively mild set of tariffs, although they do come on top of tariffs that he set first time in his first presidency and which were retained by Joe Biden in his presidency. So we've already seen one round of this game in which the United States sets tariffs. There's then a negotiation. The negotiation, which was completed in 2020, meant that China had promised to buy more agricultural products, for example, Midwestern exports and so on. And that was where we stood. But again, we have a Trump back in the White House, apparently determined to impose more tariffs on everybody. So we have another round. And last night, we had a response from China, a very swift response, because clearly China has seen this coming and had its answer ready. That answer puts tariffs on coal, on oil, on LNG, natural gas, all of which can be sourced elsewhere. It puts tariffs on large American vehicles, of which I think relatively few are imported into China in any event, because China's transport sector is electrifying faster than anyone else in the world. And then a curious measure to put the parent company of the Calvin Klein fashion brand on the entity list, which means that it's being investigated as a security threat to China. That's partly about the fact that that particular company had previously banned cotton from Xinjiang, which China, of course, doesn't like. But it's also a bit of a tit for tat for Trump putting tariffs on the direct import of goods worth less than $500. And that meant that Temu and Shine, which are Chinese brands, could mail relatively cheap clothes, for example, to American consumers. And now they will have to face taxes. But I think what we're seeing is a kind of statement of positions rather than at the moment. These are the opening shots. We haven't started the war yet.
Yeah, we'll see where this is going to take us. And this is obviously a very curious development that America's finest jeans are being caught in the crossfire of a trade war between Beijing and Washington.
Indeed.
But is it really just the trade optics here that's prevailing? And on that note, I'm going to move over to you, Kerry, and ask you, because of Donald Trump's rhetoric, we tend to now focus on that bilateral relationship primarily in terms of trade. And we see right now on the screen, obviously, the huge imbalance between imports and exports and bilateral trade between US and China. But what about all the other dimensions? Security, technological arms rates, military, political influence, infrastructural investments all over the world. Do they matter to Donald Trump at all in terms of bilateral relations with Beijing?
Last week with DeepSeek, this amazing kind of, from a clear blue sky, basically, company that proved that it could produce AI, kind of as well as very, very highly funded American companies, and apparently kind of wiped $1 trillion off their value in the space of hours. So I think China as a technology player now is a serious actor, a serious actor. It's not putting as much into research and development as the United States, but it might be doing it more effectively because of the state-run system. And it's certainly producing all sorts of, kind of peer-reviewed research, which was never the case before. So this is a real paradigm changer, and I suspect it's going to be increasingly important. Look, I mean, the Biden administration probably were defensive towards China. They regarded China as a big problem. But I don't really think that they knew specifically what they wanted. They just didn't want China, not in the way it is. I guess that Trump, well, he seems to know what he wants up to a point. He wants a deal, and that's going to be a big deal. And I think, you know, he's going to be kind of regarding this as some historic mission, that he's going to be the one that finally delivered an across the board deal on China. Trade is going to be pretty important, and balancing that, though, as we just heard, it's going to be very hard to know how you're going to balance the big deficits and surpluses that China has. But I mean, there's plenty of other areas in which America and China are going to be looking for some kind of reciprocity. That's what they want. How achievable it will be, you know, with their big differences in political and security values, I don't know. But maybe that doesn't matter to Mr. Trump. He just wants a reciprocal kind of across-the-board deal where, even in security terms, if China pays, it can play a bigger security role in the world, because, according to Trump, he doesn't want to foot that bill anymore. So I think that's what he's looking for, a highly transactional big deal.
So let's take out the big guns right here and address the elephant in the room with you, Isabel. The possibility of a full-scale trade war. We have heard numerous different threats on behalf of Donald Trump with regard to different sectors of the economy that we're going to see tariffs imposed. And we see right now on the screen a selection of those that were proposed or were rumors to be proposed by the new administration: lithium batteries, non-lithium batteries, solar cells, syringes, a number of different products, not all of which have yet been implemented. Do you think all of them will actually materialize?
Well, again, in a trade war, what matters is how much each side can hurt the other. Now, there is an imbalance in trade here, and China certainly sells more to the United States than the United States sells to China. It's quite interesting, by the way, to note what those big exports are from the US, and they're largely commodities rather than advanced manufacturing. The advanced manufacturing is going the other way. So China is selling machines and parts to the United States. But it's also selling, and this is where it can really hurt, it's also selling rare earths and strategic minerals. And China, over the past decade or so, has built up a virtual monopoly position, not on the availability of strategic minerals, but on their refining, so that even if you mine them, you know, in the Congo, they go to China for refining. Those are critical things which are needed by US industry, they're needed by US defense industry. And China added a couple of dozen of those minerals to its list of reciprocal actions last night. Now, if China really were to put the screws on the US in those terms, that would cause real pain. So when we judge whether this is going to escalate into a full-scale trade war, we really have to ask ourselves, how much is the United States prepared to take that pain, and what for? Because, as Kerry said, it's really not clear what the United States hopes to get out of this. For the last decade or so, there's been a visible policy in the United States of trying to slow China's rise. We've had restrictions on the exports of advanced computer chips, for example. And certainly in Beijing, this is perceived as simply trying to stop China attaining, what China regards as its rightful position in the world. So if we can, after this kind of reciprocal showing of the weapons, if you like, get to a grand bargain in which Donald Trump essentially says, you can have the following 6 things which are important to you, but no further. He can then declare victory and go home, rather than have a trade war. Because, as I say, it's not at all clear who gains in a trade war. And certainly China has the capacity to hurt the United States quite badly.
So you're anticipating my next question a little bit. And on that note, I'm going to move over to you, Kerry, because it seems to be the case that Donald Trump isn't particularly eager, at least right now, to target China individually. So to what extent do you think this is likely that China could be hit by American tariffs as part of a bigger coordinated attack, for instance, against all the members of the BRICS alliance? And before you answer, let's listen to Donald Trump himself announcing that kind of strategy.
China's a tremendous tariff maker, and India and Brazil and so many countries, and So we're not going to let that happen any longer because we're going to put America first, always put America first. That's what's going to happen.
So to wrap things up, how much is the anti-China shift really about China?
Well, the problem with talking about Mr. Trump is this is all. It's not really about knowledge, right? I mean, we could spend a lot of time discussing this, but it's beyond the bounds of knowledge. It's I don't know. I mean, the idea of this emotional idea of America being number one again. I mean, at the heart of it, though, is the fact, which has niggled America increasingly, that you have this player, China, which is definitely not like America, doesn't share its values, and is more and more competitive. And how do you deal with that? I mean, you can have a war, but that's not going to work because they're both nuclear powers and it would be the end game for everyone. Or you can do these sorts of things and try and kind of, prove your ascendancy by, kind of proving the power of your economy. It's very ironic. In the past, people said that China weaponized the economy and securitized the economy by punishing people, who didn't agree with it on Taiwan or Tibet or what have you, and irritated it by blocking its market. I mean, sometimes with Japan or Norway, when the late Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo was given the Nobel Prize, it kind of punished salmon kind of exporters from Norway. But now it's America sort of weaponizing its economy. It's kind of a very strange system where you now have America basically with even those who are politically aligned to it, like Canada, saying, well, our economy is our biggest weapon, and if you don't be nice to us in ways politically we want, then economically we're going to harm you. I mean, I don't really know how that works in the future because at some point it's going to become not a win-lose for America against the rest of the world. But I mean, if America's going to take every market on, it's going to be lose-lose. If it starts attacking the EU markets, for instance, like he threatened yesterday, I don't really know how that works. I mean, it's going to be, there's going to be massive, massive costs for more and more people in the United States. I mean, I think I kind of make sense of this if you're saying America wants a better deal specifically to get access to Chinese technology. Yeah, I get that. If you want more from China in terms of it putting its hand in its pocket for paying for security that protects American, Chinese sea lanes and things like that, yeah, I can understand that. But if you're looking at a total reordering of the world just by using the American economy to bully people around, including your allies, I don't see how that works. It's extremely kind of, turbulent and entertaining every day to see this, up to, grimly entertaining. But I don't really see the end game because it seems to be too broad and indiscriminate to really leave anything but losers. There'll be no winners and losers when everyone's fighting with everyone else and there's no end game.
So as per usual with Mr. Trump, we're entering uncharted territory, but nonetheless, we have to persist and try to make sense of his policies, and this is what we're going to try to do now. With you, Isabel, how much do you think he will be actually able to wrestle out of Beijing? Because it's very different when you try to bully allies, because your allies will probably want to stay allies in the future, and when you try to get something out of a competitor, not to use the word enemy. It's a very different game when he's playing against Beijing compared to the European Union or Canada or Mexico or even Colombia. So what is the ballpark of possibilities that are likely to be achieved by Trump?
Well, we should bear in mind that certainly China needs to export right now. But the problem is that the United States had already put tariffs and in some cases outright bans on the goods that China has invested in, produces in large quantity and very well and very cheaply, but can't sell in the United States. So we're looking at, electric vehicles, solar panels, everything that you need for the energy transition, anything you need for climate change. So increasingly, we've seen China divert those exports to the emerging economy. There's just last week, 2 weeks ago, there was an enormous commitment in Africa, for example, to install solar energy into 600 million Africans who don't have access to energy at all. So that's what China's doing. And, just in terms to go back to the question of who wins what out of this, What I fail to see is what America wins, the United States wins, by destroying the alliances that have supported and shared its values for the past 60 or 70 years. I don't think Donald Trump values those. I think he regards alliances as a burden rather than an asset. And if that is the case, and if he is determined to make the United States into an unreliable ally, this is just an enormous win for China. And they could certainly take a little pain on trade, which they're suffering anyway, in order to get the really big geostrategic victory. And that is just an enormous win in terms of influence, in terms of capacity to deliver on China's global ambition. China doesn't want to replace the United States. It doesn't want to take on the kind of security burden that the United States has shouldered since the end of the war, although it has benefited from it. But it does want to reorder the global rules more in its favor. And I think that Donald Trump is actually making that much more likely. In strict terms of trade, we can anticipate an end to the active hostilities rather along the lines that happened last time. I mean, if you look at the settlement or the temporary settlement with Mexico and Canada, he's essentially declared victory by proclaiming things that Canada and Mexico were already doing. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of theatre in this. And until we get to any substantive negotiations, it's hard to be precise. But I don't think it would be that hard to lower the temperature and declare victory, just as happened in 2020.
So on that note, I want to move to you, Kerry, and ask a very important question, to perhaps flip that equation a little bit, because we sort of seem to be able to understand what Donald Trump thinks of China. But what does the Chinese leadership think of Donald Trump? Would they want to engage in a confrontational kind of politics with him? Do they know what to expect with him? How did China react to Trump 2.0?
Well, I mean, they've had a while to think about him and his psychology. I mean, I think that from the interaction between Trump and Xi Jinping before, they understand that, Mr. Trump is a narcissistic individual who is extremely interested in people, kind of praising him and making him look good. And I think the Chinese are very able to do that. I mean, they were able to accommodate him when he went to Beijing the first time in ways where he was obviously, kind of really, really impressed. Last year for Fox TV, he said that Mr. Xi was a fine-looking man. He said extremely complimentary things about Xi Jinping, and I suspect he envies the powers that Xi Jinping has and wished he had the same suite of powers in his own system. I mean, I think what you've got is a narcissist versus a sociopath. I mean, a narcissist as
doesn't sound too promising for world affairs, if you please. Doesn't sound all too promising.
Well, I mean, but the sociopath usually wins. I mean, I think China is an extremely good negotiator, amazingly good negotiator, and I don't think this is. I think they can deal with this. Not many people can, but I think that they can. I think Mr. Trump is a really, really good Chinese leader because, I mean, he's doing all the Communist Party of China General Secretary has to do, but he's the President of the United States. What's not to like? I think this is all looking good for China at the moment. It's all looking good.
Well, that wasn't a particularly optimistic assessment on behalf of you, Kerry, but we will certainly be coming back to the topic of US and China relations. They're too big to clash, too ambitious to simply coexist. These relations will linger in the background of pretty much everything for the next few years, so there will be plenty more to talk about. Isabel, Hilton, Kerry Brown were our guests tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The relative silence on China during Trump's first weeks in office doesn't mean he won't escalate in the future. As conventional wisdom from Washington dictates, this time round, we should treat him seriously, but not literally. Which means a showdown can still take place. It will definitely be one for the books, as Xi Jinping won't let himself be bullied by the Americans. Buckle up, everybody. This thing is far from over. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will change gears a little bit and look at the shambolic state of foreign and development aid globally. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday, and have a good evening.